We're doing our last objection this week. Feels like a bit of a marathon, I suppose. We've done 7, and what we had was 150 or so objections which came in via the website and on cards and over email and all sorts, and probably personal yelling occasionally as well. And we've tried to condense those 150 into 7 questions, and obviously some have got lost in the rounding, and we're picking those up in the printer's bar evenings, but many of them have been able to be addressed in some way through one of the 7 talks. And this week, our last question is, why do people believe in God when there's no evidence he exists? Why do people believe in God when there's no evidence he exists? And that's my summary of a whole bunch of objections that we got around the whole issue of evidence and proof and ideas like that. So I'm just going to put a few of them up here on the screen, but again, they're all online. You can go and see them on our website just to see what people have been saying. But here's a sample. Hi, I have no evidence in there being a God. I have no explanation for how this amazing planet was made, but I cannot just shrug my shoulders and say, God must have done it. No problem at all with anyone who does believe, though. Next one said, how can any sane person believe that there is some unseen God out there somewhere? It's a crutch used by weak people to try to explain and justify things which have happened in their lives. Get real and face up to the fact that what happens to us is up to both luck and our own decisions, not some mystical presence. Another person said, at the end of the day, perhaps we all just believe what we feel and what we want. I want to feel close to the natural universe, and I feel part of it. There's so much power and meaning, so much greater than me, but there's no room for a God who seems to have such a human male ego. On the other hand, if that's what makes you feel safe, another one, it's irrational. The evidence and support of faith in a Christian God, i.e. the Bible, was written by men thousands of years ago. Why do Christians just accept their version of the truth, good story though, when anyone could have written anything? And the last one for now, why do you assume people object? It may be that they just giggle indulgently like they do about the children who believe in the tooth fairy. There you go. Well, that's actually a good example of an indulgent giggle, so good. In other words, there is no evidence for God, except the Bible, which is old and written by Middle Eastern men, so it obviously can't be trusted. Therefore, we should all stop being so silly. That's basically what the objections are saying. And we talked about the Bible and the fact that Middle Eastern men 2,000 years ago weren't quite necessarily as dumb as we think. But all the same, we're going to spend this morning not focusing on the Bible side because we've done that in a previous week. But we're instead going to be doing 3 things to engage with this challenge. Why do people believe in God without evidence? 3 main steps I want to take. And the first one is to try and provide some evidence and quickly give 5 good arguments for the existence of God, right? Just 5. There's about 20 I think we could do, but I think if I gave 20, you'd forget all of them. If I do 5, you might forget 4 of them, and we'll have 1 left over, and that'll be something to talk about later. So we're going to do, firstly, just 5 quick good arguments for the existence of God. Secondly, though, I want to explain why that is not enough. It just isn't enough to convince or persuade or compel belief out of anybody. And then the third thing I'm going to do is to suggest a way forward that saying, even though it isn't enough, here's what I think we can do about that. Okay? So provide some evidence, then explain why that's not enough, and then suggest a way forward. And the first thing I'm going to do, 5 good arguments for the existence of God. And obviously, if we're talking about evidence, what we do need to do is to understand what we mean by evidence. And so I'm going to just assume out front that nobody is expecting me to do a scientific experiment at the end of which there is a test tube and a little thing called God inside that proves that God exists. I just trust that no one thinks that I'm stupid enough to try that, and that no one here is stupid enough to think that's what evidence for God might look like. That's clearly not what we're doing. How could a fish prove the existence of water? How could Hamlet prove the existence of Shakespeare? It just doesn't work that way, does it? So when we're talking about proving the existence of God or evidence for the existence of God, we are not saying there's a scientific thing we can do like we can prove oxygen. That's just not the way things work. We can't have scientific evidence for God any more than we can have scientific evidence for historical events or for memories or whatever. But we can provide logical evidence for the existence of God in the form of good arguments. And so I'm going to use, just as I say, just 5 and just list them, but this isn't going to be the main body of the talk. I think it might be helpful nonetheless. The first good argument, just out of 5, first one, the argument from design. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, i.e. the universe has to be there because of what it is, or chance, luck, or design. Right? Premise 1. Premise 2, if the universe is designed, then its designer is God. That shouldn't be that controversial, really. If the whole order of everything physical is designed, it must be designed by a non-physical, immaterial power, and that's what Christians believe God is. So you can't prove it's the God of the Bible, but you could prove that there was a God, if that was true. Thirdly, the fine-tuning of the universe isn't due to physical necessity or chance. In other words, the universe doesn't have to be there. There was a long time ago, it wasn't. According to what most scientists are telling us, there used not to be a universe, now there is. So the universe is not physically necessary. It might have been there, it might not. And similarly, there's a lot of good reasons to think that the universe is not here by chance, which is something that we looked at in a bit more detail in the very first week of this series, looking at the issue of science and faith. And so actually, there's a lot of things about the cosmos as it is now that indicate strongly that it is not simply a result of chance events. Now, obviously, that takes a bit more demonstration, which we don't have time for here, but we did, as I say, a talk on that a few weeks back. But if that was the case, then the fine-tuning, step 4, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to design. If it's got to be due to physical necessity, chance, or design, and it's not due to necessity, and it's not due to chance, it must be due to design. That's step 4. Therefore, the designer of the universe, from steps 2 and 4, is God. That's a fairly straightforward argument for the existence of God based on design. The challenges usually come around step 3, and that's where we spent a decent amount of time earlier on in the series looking at that one. But if 3 holds up, that's a watertight argument. Second argument for the existence of God out of the 5, the argument for morality. This one's simpler. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. There is no basis for objective morality if there is no God. There might be all sorts of bases for saying, I don't like that. I find war unpleasant. I don't like being bombed. I don't like torture happening or genocide. But I can't say that they're wrong or evil. I can simply say that I prefer not to have them. There's no moral basis without God because there's no lawgiver, right? There's no moral law if there's no lawgiver. So if you don't have a God, there is no basis to say that's just wrong. There's a basis to say I don't like it, but not a basis to say it's evil or wrong. Step 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, though. They do. And most people in this country instinctively feel that's true as well, which is good. It's true. Objective, there is such a thing as a right and a wrong. It's not just that in the 1930s, being a Jew in Nazi Germany, I don't just have to resign myself to the fact, well, I'm in a minority here. I mean, I know there's a few million of us, but there's many more millions of them, and they generally think that we're worth persecuting, so that's what, I'll just have to lump it. It's not my preference. And you and I would say, no. You're allowed to say it's evil. It is wrong. It's wrong. It's sick. It's evil. It's twisted. That's absolutely, objectively wrong. It's not just a matter of the strong killing the weak, which happens everywhere in nature. This is a different order of things. This is evil. Objective moral values and duties do exist. But if those two are both true, step 3 logically must follow. Therefore, God exists. If God doesn't exist, there is no objective morality. But there is objective morality, therefore God must exist. Right? It's quite a straightforward, logical argument there. Number 3, the cosmological argument. You throw in an illogical and everybody feels like they're getting their money's worth, which I hope will help. Step 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Right? That's a statement about the nature of reality. Everything that there is either has to be there because of what it is, or it's been caused by something else. Step 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. If there is an explanation for the universe, there might not be, but if there is, the only thing we could really call that would be God, because the universe is the sum total of physical reality, and for that to be caused by something else, it must be caused then by an immaterial reality. Otherwise, it would be simply part of the universe. Therefore, if the universe is caused, it's caused by God. Step 3, less controversial, the universe exists. Trust most of us probably believe that. 4, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence from 1 and 3. Therefore, from 2 and 4, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Now logically that all ties up, right? You might question or debate 1 or 2 of the premises, which is okay, but the logic of the argument flows. So if the premises are true, the conclusion's true. You enjoying this so far? So 3 down, 2 to go. The next one is a bit more out the box. The argument from you. If materialism is not true, then God exists. Right? So materialism is the belief that the only thing that there is matter, physical stuff. There is no spiritual dimension to anything. There is simply matter and physical stuff. If materialism isn't true, then there must be a God, because there must be a source of immaterial reality as well as material reality. If materialism isn't true, God exists. Step 2, if anything fundamentally immaterial exists, then materialism isn't true. Which means if I could find just one thing anywhere in the universe, one thing that wasn't fundamentally and essentially matter, even just one item, materialism is hogwash. Can't be right, because materialism says everything's matter. If I find one thing that isn't reducible to matter, I've debunked it and kind of proved God. Step 3, you exist. And you go, well, that's not very clever, Mr. Preacher. You point your finger and say it significantly, but that hasn't convinced me of anything. Well, step 4, you cannot finally be identified with anything in your physical body. And here's the claim. You go out and commit a crime today. In 30 years' time, the entity that you now are will have none of the same atoms. Every single atom that currently comprises the you that's sitting here listening to this will have gone and become part of something else, part of the water supply, or drifted down into the sea, or be part of the hills, or been eaten by a dog. I don't know where it'll be, but it won't be part of you. All the atoms will have gone. And all of the atoms that will comprise you in 30 years' time are now somewhere else. Part of the sea, eaten by a dog, goodness knows. Isn't that a strange idea? But that's true, right? The nitrogen and oxygen and components of you in 30 years' time are currently part of dogs and grass and trees and water. Now, some of you are weirded out by this idea, but it's true. You will replace yourself somewhere between every 7 to 10 years. In other words, if I was to put you on trial in 30 years' time for a crime you committed today, you could legitimately say, but none of the atoms are the same. I didn't do it, but another bunch of atoms did it. And you'd be right. And at that point, I suspect the judge would say, do you know what? The fact that the atoms are not the same as the atoms that committed the crime does not mean that you are exempt, because we believe in this legal system that you are still accountable for things you did, even though the atoms that form you are totally different. At which point, I win. Because I say, in that case, you cannot be reducible simply to the material parts of your body. You must believe that there is something that comprises you that is not reducible to atoms. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to say that. And I could every time, if I get away with a crime for 10 years, I can say, I'm done, different atoms, not me. The last one's left my big toe, I'm done. Double jeopardy. And you wouldn't let me get away with that, because you say, but you actually is something that isn't simply matter. Therefore, number 5, something fundamentally immaterial exists. You. Therefore, materialism isn't true from 2 and 5. Therefore, God exists from 1 and 6. Boom. It's good fun, isn't it? Okay? Number 5, the argument from love, freedom, and thought, which is similar. If the last one annoyed you, this one will too. If you like the last one, this one will be nice too. Number 1, if materialism's true, all our loves, thoughts, and actions are determined by the unthinking, non-rational movement of chemicals in our skulls. Every single thing you've ever done is non-thinking. It's not thinking, it's not cognitive. It feels like it is, but it isn't. It's just a result of collisions of chemicals, if materialism is true. Number 2, therefore, if materialism is true, we have no freedom of love, thought, and action. This is the case that I ended up randomly debating on the radio with the guy from the Council for the National Secular Society, who was making exactly this case. There is no such thing as freedom. It's a complete illusion. You do not make any free decisions. They are all programmed results of chemical collisions in your head, and you have no control over any of them. It just feels like you do. Step 3, but we do experience freedom of love, thought, and action. We know that no matter what the secular society band says or what the philosophers say, that I do actually experience freedom to choose Weetabix or cornflakes. And I do have decisions about who I'm going to marry and about whether or not I'm going to kill somebody and all sorts of everyday decisions. That's horrible. It makes it sound like I decide whether or not to kill people every day. Scrub that from the edit online. I didn't mean it. But anyway, all sorts of everyday decisions. You and I make decisions, and we do actually experience freedom in the act. But if that's true, then immaterial realities exist and materialism is false. And if that's true, immaterial realities like love, freedom, and thought require an immaterial gift giver that we may call God. It can't be that matter has produced immaterial realities somehow. Instead, we have to say, don't we, look, material realities can produce other material ones, but if there's an immaterial reality, it must have been created by an immaterial creator, which is what God is. Therefore, number 6, God exists. Now, those are not the only 5. They're just the 5 I chose. There's another 15 or so good ones you could use. But to stand back from that and say, actually, there are quite a lot of good bits of evidence for the existence of God. But the point is, and this is perhaps the surprise, maybe you thought I was going to do the whole talk on that, but actually the point is that good arguments for God are not enough. They simply aren't. And this is the second section of my talk this morning. Even good arguments, logically coherent, sound, cogent arguments, are not enough to make people believe. And the reason for that is simple. We think we believe things because of simple, logical, dispassionate deduction, but we don't. Our desires form a huge part of what we believe, and often more of a part of what we believe than our deductions do. We are not simply making deductive choices and logical statements about everything. We desire things, and as a result, we choose to believe things because we want to believe them as often as not. And even if the evidence isn't as compelling for something, we will still choose to believe it. In other words, we require far more evidence to believe stuff that we don't want to believe than stuff we do. So you watch the football match, at the end of the game, you ask the 2 managers, was that a penalty? What happens? The guy whose team was awarded the penalty, even though he's got nothing to gain from it, genuinely believes it was a penalty. The side who was penalized genuinely believe that it wasn't a penalty. They watch the same event, seen the same replay, and they will still argue about it. And that's because the manager who was awarded the penalty doesn't take very much evidence to believe that it's a penalty because he wants to believe it. And the other guy takes a huge amount of evidence because he doesn't want to believe it. So the burden of proof is very different for the 2 men. Or you ask a mother, did your child start that fight or did hers? And you'll find the mother will almost always side with her own child because she's more predisposed to believe that her child simply wouldn't do something like that. Ask the Christian, does God exist? And the Christian will require more evidence to believe the answer is no than yes. Ask the skeptic, say the person who said, it's like the tooth fairy. Ask that person, does God exist? They could watch the 5 arguments we've just given and say, doesn't matter. La, 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 doesn't matter. I don't care because I still don't believe it. Because you say, we put very high burdens of proof for things we don't want to believe and very low ones for things we do. Here's 3 quotes from leading atheists that make that point pretty well. This is Richard Dawkins. We quoted this earlier in the series actually. You could persuade me that there was a God who created everything, but this is incompatible with a God who cares about your sin, what you do with your genitals, and what you think about. I don't mind the idea of there being an abstract God, but I am not going to entertain the prospect of there being a God who tells me that I can't have sex with so-and-so. Not having it. Sex is my God, not you. Right? It's based on desire. Thomas Nagel, even more bluntly, philosophy professor at New York University, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. It's admirably honest and true. Richard Lewontin, writing in the New York Review 15 odd years ago, as scientist, he said, our materialism is absolute because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. We force ourselves to think materially about everything because if we don't, God might get his foot in the door and we have no idea where that will lead. In other words, if you're reasonably bright and if you firmly, stridently, and fiercely don't want there to be a God, you will not believe in one, in all probability. That's not to say that evidence doesn't do any good. That's not to say that you've all been wasting the last 6 or 7 weeks of Sundays sitting here going, what on earth's the point of that then? You can't prove anything. Well, when the manager sees the replay, sometimes he concedes, actually, it wasn't a penalty. And sometimes the mother sees the incident and says, you know, that was our kid's fault. People are not completely closed to evidence. But desire plays an important part, and as a result, evidence on its own is usually insufficient to convince people of anything. There are some wonderful examples of people who have become Christians as a result, almost just of being ground down by evidence. C.S. Lewis is one of the most famous in this country in the last 100 years or so, described himself, he said, I didn't want to be a Christian, I was the most reluctant convert in the whole country. But I got worn down by thinking it through and by the evidence. That does happen sometimes, but for most people, there's a fusion of desire and deduction which comes together, and that evidence alone is not enough. So you could, I'm afraid, show the 5 arguments we've just used to anybody who doesn't want to believe, and that will not be enough for them. And that's okay. That's the way we're wired. We are not simply thinking creatures. We're creatures of desire as well. But where does that leave us? That's then the question. Well, that feels like you've led me right up the garden path and then slapped me with a wet fish and sent me back again. I don't understand why we're here. And there is good evidence for God, but it isn't enough unless our desires change. So what next? And that leads on to the third and final section. You see, someone who knew more about this problem than almost anybody else who's ever lived was a guy called the Apostle Paul, who was an early church leader and church planter and traveling missionary. And he spent his life proclaiming the good news about Jesus. That's what he did as soon as he became a Christian. He preached to all kinds of people all around the world that Jesus died in our place to reconcile us to God, and that he rose again and he conquered death. And then when he was doing that, he found some people loved it and went, well, hey, that sounds great, sign me up. And other people hated it and threw rocks at his head and chased him out of town and shipwrecked him and beat him with the 39 lashes and all sorts of other things. And Paul reflected on that strangeness as he wrote letters, often from prison. And he reflected on the oddity of preaching the same message and people from the same town or city hearing it, and some people thinking this is worth killing him for, and other people saying this is worth dying for. And he reflected on that. And at one point he said, it's like I give off different smells to people in the same room. He said, it's like I preach the message of Jesus and I find that some people hear it and it's like the smell of a fresh, aromatic spring day in Tuscany, and other people hear the same words come out of my mouth and think it smells of death, like Hull. And how is it that I can preach the same message and find some people think of Tuscany and some people think of Hull? How did that happen? Apologies to Hull people in the room. And as he was preaching, he was realizing there's something about this message that divides people, and it's not that they're all logically forming conclusions on the basis of what I said. And he found that people were continually fobbing him off and asking demanding stuff in order to say, well, all right, you meet my burden of proof then, Paul. And he's put it like this. He said, look, I find that people are often asking me for miracles. They're often saying, why don't you, and it wasn't this example, but turn that music stand into a goat and I will become a Christian. He said some people are like that. They just want miracles, and they'll I'll believe if there's a miracle. And then he said there are other people who want wisdom. They want these very eloquent, beautifully structured, flowy kind of deductions that lead me all the way through. And he said, I don't do that mostly. I do miracles. I reason and debate with. I do that all the time, actually. But the heart of what I'm about is not doing either of those things. I do something else. He put it like this in his first letter to the Corinthian church. He said, Jews want miracles and Greeks look for wisdom. But what we preach is a crucified Messiah. It's annoying to some and it's stupid to others, but it's God's mighty power to the people who believe. That's what I do. So I could do the miracles, but that wouldn't convince everybody. I could do the arguments and that wouldn't convince everybody either. So what I do is I just herald and announce a crucified Messiah, and I find that's where the power comes from. And I'm going to take a leaf out of Paul's book as we conclude this series and as we conclude this talk. And as we turn our attention in the year to Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and I want to remind you of the heart of the Christian story. Some of you may not have heard it said this way before, and I'm going to give you a kind of fairly lengthy reading with the rest of my time from a book by the Guardian journalist Francis Spufford, and he just tells the heart of the Christian story in, I think, quite a helpful and fresh way. So I just want to read it to you. And just bear in mind, this is what we do. We have evidence, it's not enough. We need to come to terms with and engage with Christ crucified. That's what Paul would tell you, that's what I'm telling you as well. And here's how Francis Spufford describes that. He's called Yeshua, which is the Aramaic name for Jesus, so it's what he was originally called. Yeshua is never disgusted. He never says that anything or anyone is too dirty to be touched, that anyone is too lost to be found. Even in situations where there seem to be no grounds for human hope, he will not agree that hope is gone beyond recall. Wreckage may be written into the logic of the world, but he will not agree that it's all there is. He says, more can be mended than you fear. Far more can be mended than you know. Daylight finds him in a procession again, but this time no one could mistake him for a king. He's stumbling along under the weight of his own instrument of execution, a great big wooden thing that he can hardly lift, with an escort of the empire's soldiers and the bystanders who've come blinking out of the lodgings where they've spent the festival night. They don't see their hopes or even the possibility of their hopes parading by. They see their disappointment. They see their frustration. They see everything in themselves that's too weak or too afraid to confront the strapping paratroopers. And much though they hate the soldiers, they hate him more for his pathetic slide into victimhood. Word of his loose living, his impiety, his pleasure in bad company goes around in whispers. Just look at him. There's something disgusting about him, don't you think? Something that makes you squirm inside. He's something furtive. He's so pale and sickly looking with that dried blood around his mouth. He looks like a paedophile being led away by the police. He looks like something from under a rock, as if he doesn't deserve the daylight. He's a blot on the new day. Someone kicks him as he goes by, and whoops, down he goes, flat on his nose with the cross pinning him like a struggling insect. And let's face it, it's funny. Yeshua is a joke. He's less a Messiah, more a patch of something nasty on the pavement. And as he struggles on, he recognizes every roaring, jeering face. He knows our names. He knows our histories. But it's killing him all the same. He never promised that you'd be safe if you tried to live without fear. The soldiers lead him out of the city gate, and laboriously slipping and sliding with crunching blows from spear butts to motivate him, they drive him up the small cone of Skull Hill where death sentences are carried out. They tie him onto the cross and plant it upright. It's the empire's punishment for rebellious slaves, slow and nasty by design, devised to be a spectacle of days-long struggle and gasping to passers-by. On a cross, you choke to death, and you're finally too tired to heave your own weight up to take the next breath. And Yeshua's cross has a sign above it, over his head. "Here's your king," it says, in all the languages of the province. The chief priest didn't want it, but the governor has a point to make, and Yeshua hangs there. He twists against the ropes to snatch the precious air which whistles in his flattened nose. He can't do anything deliberate now. The strain of his whole weight on his outstretched arms hurts too much. The pain fills him up, displaces thought as much for him as it has for anyone who's ever been struck on one of those horrible contrivances. And then he goes on taking in. It's not what he does, it's what he is. He is all open door to sorrow, suffering, guilt, despair, horror, everything that can't be escaped. And he doesn't even try to escape it. He turns to meet it and claims it all as his own. This is mine now, he's saying, and he embraces it with all that's left in him, each dark act, each dripping memory, as if it were something precious, as if it were itself, the loved child tottering along the road homeward. But there's so much of it. There's so many injured children, so many locked rooms, so much lonely anger, so many bombs in public places, so much vicious zeal, so many bored teenagers at roadblocks, so many drunk girls at parties someone thought they could have a little fun with, so many jokes that go too far, so much ruining greed, so much sick ingenuity, and so much burned skin. The world he claims him. It burns and it stings, it splinters and gouges, it locks him round and it drugs him down. There's nothing to keep him company there but the light he's always felt shining beneath things. But the light is going. He's so deep down now in the geology of woe, so buried beneath the mountain's weight of it, that the pressure is squeezing out his feeling for the light. There's nothing left of it but a speck, a pinpoint the world grinds in on itself, a dot dimming as the strata of the dark are piled heavier and heavier on it, and then it goes out. Of course it does. Love can't repair death. Death is stronger than love. We all know that. But Yeshua didn't until now. This is the first time in his entire life he's ever felt alone. Now, there's no love song. There's no kind father. There's just a man on a cross, dying in pain, a foolish man who chose to give up life and breath to be a carcass on a pole. The yellow walls of the city blur with Yeshua's tears, and he opens his mouth and howls the news, new only to him, that we are abandoned in a dark place where help never comes. The friends creep out at dusk and ask for the body, promising anonymous burial and no fuss. They're allowed to carry it away, wrapped in a tube of linen that slowly stains from the inside. Skull Hill sees lots of such corteges. There's only time to stick what's left of Yeshua hastily in a rock tomb by the highway. Washing the corpse properly and laying it out will have to wait. The Holy Saturday is coming, and no one wants any confrontations. All day long, the next day, the city is quiet. The air above the city lacks the usual 1,000 little trails of smoke from cook fires. Hymns rise from the temple. Families are indoors. The soldiers are back in barracks. The chief priest grows hoarse with singing. The governor plays chess with his secretary and dictates letters. The free bread the temple distributed to the poor has gone stale by midday, but it tastes all right dipped in water or broth. Death has interrupted life only as much as it ever does. We die one at a time and we disappear, but the life of the living continues. The earth turns. The sun makes its way towards the western horizon no slower or faster than it usually does. Early Sunday morning, one of the friends comes back with rags and a jug of water and a box of the grave spices that are supposed to cut down on the smell. She's braced for the task. But when she comes to the grave, she finds that the linen's been thrown in the corner and the body's gone. Evidently, anonymous burial isn't quite anonymous enough after all. She sits outside in the sun. The insects have woken up here at the edge of the desert, and a bee's nosing around in a lily like silk thinly tucked over itself, but much more perishable. It won't last long. She takes no notice of the feet that appear at the edge of her vision. That's enough now, she thinks. That's more than enough. Don't be afraid, says Yeshua. Far more can be mended than you know. There's plenty of evidence for God, but it isn't enough. Only the crucified and risen Jesus is enough. And doing that leaves plenty of questions unanswered, and that's okay. And tonight we're going to be at Printer's Bar talking about them and giving an opportunity to debate and discuss them. But can I suggest to those of you who perhaps maybe not even have objections, or you're curious, or you're not even sure you want to come and raise them, you just want to think about it. Can I just encourage you this Easter, take this week. It's Palm Sunday today. Take this week. It's Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, to think about the cross of Jesus, read about it, watch something on it. Try and consider the impact of that moment on which 2 billion people say the history of the world changed. Consider it carefully. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being a part of the series. Thank you for having the humility and courage to come in a context like this to engage with it. We're really glad you came. And I'll hand back to Graham.